Hello and welcome to another Transfer Talk podcast special. I'm very pleased to say we're joined by the former Manchester City Chief Executive, Garry Cook. Garry, welcome along. We're going to have you for a little while, so do be patient with us. We just want you to give us an idea for our listeners, a bit of your story. Born in Birmingham, moved to the US in 1985, and then you joined Nike in 1996, if my research is correct. Just give us an idea of what your role was back then.
I came from a football background, having worked in the football sports industry. But my last job there was the most interesting. I was the president of Michael Jordan's brand, and of course, you know, that's a pretty good brand to be involved in.
Quite one then. Let's fast forward to 2008. And did it come as a surprise to you when the Manchester City owner then, Thaksin Shinawatra, approaches you to become chief executive of the football club? And did you have any hesitation in accepting that?
You know, a boyhood dream, being British and following the Premier League and of course following the First Division in its old form. I had turned down a couple of jobs in football. I think we were always vulnerable for people looking to bring new blood into the football world. And we see it today all the time now. It's very often you don't necessarily see the regurgitation of football people, but you see a lot of other industry experts come into this industry. And so I turned it down a couple of times, and we were going backwards and forwards on a few different issues. But it was one of those that you just can't turn down. And in retrospect, I suppose, probably should have done a bit more due diligence on where I was going and who I was getting involved in. But I think your heart follows, it leads the way, and off I went.
When you arrived there, within a month or two, the manager who's in situ at the time, Sven-Göran Eriksson, goes, sacked. Was that your decision? How much input did you have in that decision?
What I was really clear about when I went into football was I think that there was a lack of planning, strategy and long-term vision thinking. Everybody was thinking about the result on Saturday. So all the resources were focused on the result on Saturday. And you can't run a business in that way. Sven had come to the end, I think, of his tenure as the manager, and we then were putting a plan together, and as part of that plan we felt that we needed to make some management changes.
So you said make management changes. Mark Hughes did come in. Was he the first choice, or did you speak to anyone else at that time?
We wanted somebody that could embrace the passion of Manchester and understand what it meant to Manchester. And as part of the strategy, it was like, how do we identify somebody who knows the Premier League, understands the culture, understands the ambition? And Mark Hughes was a perfect fit for that.
You mentioned earlier, Garry, about you'd wished you'd done a little bit more due diligence, and very soon the turmoil hit the club, if you like, with the assets of Shinawatra being frozen. As that was all unfolding, what was going through your head then? What am I doing here?
Yeah, I think so. I think if you look at the way that football clubs were run at the time, there were very few publicly limited companies. They were all private entities, and so you don't really get to see what's behind the curtain. And with that in mind, you follow your passion, you follow your dream. When you get in there and you pull it all back and find out what's going on, it's a little startling. And again, we were then confronted with the challenges that came with Thaksin Shinawatra and his political environment. Of course, we were trying to always separate the two, because our job was to run the football club and to manage the football club. But to do that, you needed funding, and unfortunately, with his political status, a lot of his assets had been seized. So the issue was the challenge. The next step was find a solution, and we sort of set about then trying to find a way. So within 10 days of being inside the football club, and my furniture was on the water coming from Portland, Oregon, and I thought at the time I'd probably made a pretty big mistake.
When you say about the situation with Shinawatra and his assets, how precarious did it get? How bad did it get? Did it ever get to the point where this club could go out of business?
It was a reality. That statement was a reality, and I think you've got to pay your operational expenses, and the revenues weren't what they are today, and Neither were the salaries. But at the same time, there were two line items that were pretty big. The biggest being salaries for players, and you got to pay the bills. And when you've got no income, and what we'd done actually, and most football clubs were doing this at the time, is you can actually, if you like, sell your future revenues to the banks. The banks would take that risk on. They'd earn an interest rate off that. And Manchester City, you always hear about leveraged position, and financially we were well leveraged. There wasn't much left. So there was a bit of a road crash starting to happen, which was no revenues incoming because it all was belonging to the banks. We had got a lot of players that we were paying, and we'd also started to sign some players and put deposits down on players. So it all started to go a little bit wrong, and then you've got no investment capital coming in from the owners. That only ends in one thing.
Enter then the Abu Dhabi United Group. I guess they changed not only the face of Manchester City, but now we're seeing it, they've effectively changed the face of the Premier League as well. How did that come about, and how did you pinpoint them?
As a team of people, the first thing we were doing, we were out looking for potential buyers. Once we created the book and gone into the city and started to look for people to invest in the football club, what was very clear to us was we didn't really want to have a partial investor. We needed a 100% owned proposition. And by virtue of various contacts and various meetings, what we weren't selling was a football club, interestingly enough. And I think this is where a lot of it gets missed, because we talk about it through the lens of football. But the Abu Dhabi United Group, under the auspices of sovereign wealth, business investment, economic development, economic growth, everything that they were doing had a long-term vision to it. Everything was being talked about at the time as the 2020 vision. Now, this was back in 2008.
When you hear of clubs being taken over now, and there's rumours of various groups interested in a football club, I cite, for example, Newcastle United. It seems to be very, very protracted. It seems to appear and then it goes quiet, and then for the last 3 or 4 years we keep hearing the same story with Newcastle. How protracted, if at all, was the City takeover, or was it much easier than you had envisaged it to be, perhaps?
It was very quick, and actually, if you look back now, it was somewhat professionally naive on both parties. It was sort of a one-page document that said, "Hey, we're going to buy a football club, and can you make sure we get a marquee player at the end of the window, or before the end of the window?" So it was all a bit sort of back of the napkin, and I think that was the element of time more than it was the way that people behaved. Particularly as I got to learn the way that the Abu Dhabi management team worked. It was so foreign to how they behave that it was sort of all a bit surreal, really.
You mentioned marquee players. Let's give you a reminder. Nearly £80 million spent in that summer transfer window. Joe for £18 million, Tel by Naheem for £5 million. It's incredible when you look at these names, considering the names that City go for now. Perhaps the standout one there, Vincent Kompany, £6 million. Sean Wright-Phillips, Pablo Zabaleta, and then Robinho, which we will come to in just a moment. But who identified these players? How big a role did you play?
Well, there was an entire team. As the CEO of the football club, you are representing the board. But at the same time, it's really down to the manager. I mean, the manager is the one that has a strategy and a philosophy. Mark's strategy and philosophy was he wanted people who'd been in the Premier League, who knew how to win football matches in the Premier League. And if you look at the list, they were successful footballers in the Premier League at that given point in time. There is a protocol, and I think it'd be fair to say that protocols often get broken because the demands for the talent far outweigh the needs to follow the protocol. But I think, in fairness, those first players were a signature of change, but they weren't completely the full ambition of where we were trying to get.
How ambitious were you in that window, though? I mentioned these names. Was there anyone that we probably don't know about then, but you can tell us now that you came close to, or that you made a bid for? Or?
Yeah, not necessarily in that window. I think as time went on, we would continue to look further afield, and I think the one that's most well documented, of course, was Kaka. But I think when you get further down the pathway, you start to then get a bit more ambitious, and we start to say, okay, we've got to change the face of Manchester City, because the biggest challenge was getting people to come to Manchester City. That wasn't, people think that's, that must have been the easiest thing. It was actually very, very difficult to get people to sign for Manchester City at the time.
Let's get to Robinho then. You broke the British transfer record when you signed him. It was announced on the morning of deadline day. How did it come about though? When did those negotiations start?
The 24th of August, the discussions began around...
A week before?
Around the club takeover. So,
wow.
Yeah. And part of the deal was we need to sign a player prior to the end, again, to state and declare the ambition. But on that day, or during that week, it's really very simple. You basically create a list of marquee players around the world, and you try and identify anybody that you can try and bring to the football club. Because if you don't, your football club doesn't get taken over.
That deadline day is still perhaps one of the most memorable as far as Sky Sports News are concerned as well. In the morning you had the Robinho with Mark Hughes, and then in the evening you see Sir Alex Ferguson and Dimitar Berbatov walking along the corridor at Old Trafford. But it could have been different, couldn't it? How close were you to signing Dimitar Berbatov?
Well, I wouldn't say we were close to signing any of them, because you've got to get to the stage where they want to come. And again, going through the protocols, you've got to get a lot of decisions made. So it's like anything, if you get asked the question, would you? Then if you get a yes, then that's usually a good indication to keep moving on. But we couldn't really get anybody to get to that point. That didn't stop us keep asking the question, right? But I think if you think about that day, that was probably the day, and Sky did a brilliant job, by the way, that was probably the day that the deadline media megatrend took place. That was the very first day, if you remember, because nobody quite knew what was going to happen. If you think about it, right, within a week, Manchester City had been taken over by some of the most successful and wealthiest owners in the world, not just in football, but in the world. And within that week, we'd signed a Brazilian national team player of great note from Real Madrid. If you were a City fan, and remember, as a City fan, if you were a 10-year-old boy, you didn't wear a City shirt to school. You wouldn't dare. You were embarrassed. And it was a club that was steeped in mediocrity compared to its rivals in the same city. So what it was really wonderful about that moment was the belief and the hope that we'd given to a lot of people who spend hard-earned money supporting that football club. And so they all played part of the story, and if it was ever to be a book that was written, and it has been well documented, it's a wonderful story, but we should never forget who it impacted the most. It was the fans.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, if we fast forward to January, you've touched on potentially what could have been one of the biggest transfers in the history of the game. Just talk us through what happened with Kaka.
One of the things that we always said was we need a marquee player. Robinho had done okay, but we needed that player that was going to say, this is a club that's going somewhere. This is a football club that's going to make a difference. But it took a bold player to make that statement. And the irony of it was that Kaka had been brought to us, they usually are, by an agent, said, hey, interest, spoken to him, would you be interested? We informed the football club said, yeah, there were a few guys involved. And so off to Milan we went, sat down with them and said, we have ambition, we'd like to...
So you sat down with Kaka?
Yeah. But prior to that, you have to sit down with the football club.
Right.
So we sat down with the football club and we signed a document that sold the player to Manchester City. So we bought him. Then the next stage is you have to then negotiate with the player. And I think if you remember back then, the whole story got played out in the media Silvio Berlusconi was the owner at the time, and it all got played out in the media. And if anybody remembers, Kaká was sort of waving his AC Milan shirt out on his balcony. And at that time then you kind of think, well, you know what, I think we may have been perhaps used. And so naivety, maybe, over-ambitious, maybe, but never once in doubt of where we were going. It was just a case of when.
In your heart of hearts, how close do you think it came? Do you think you got to getting Kaká into a City shirt?
Well, we sat down with him and we sat down with his father and we discussed the terms, but it didn't appear that he was aligned with where he wanted to go. I think he's publicly said he wasn't convinced, and I think that's a fair assessment. I actually caught up with him at Robinho's wedding in Sao Paulo and asked him why he didn't come, and he said, you know, I was at AC Milan and I had Manchester City, what would you do? And he's right.
So, no Kaká, but that window, you're now, quality of players is going up a notch. Wayne Bridge, Craig Bellamy, Nigel de Jong, Shay Given. It looks like that those players, there was a certain strategy, it seems, all Premier League experience. Was that the way City were going at that stage?
Yeah, that was Mark's direction. When you've got a manager, like any role in business, you've got to delegate their authority and allow them to have a strong opinion of what they want, because at the end of the day they're going to be judged on the outcome. And Mark wanted some very highly qualified players from the Premier League, and that was, I think it was only Nigel really who hadn't played in the Premier League. But again, he, you know, like Vincent, he proved to be a great asset to have in the team.
Aside of Kaká, who you missed out on, were there any other players that were offered to you that you went for, the so-called marquee player, that perhaps didn't work out and you maybe thought he could have joined?
Yes, we were no different to any other football club though, Damashi. You know, you have to understand the process, which is, right, if we had the chance to bring any footballer to it's a little bit fantasy league. And so the conversations, they were ongoing with a lot of people. You know,
give us a couple of names.
Well, whether it was John Terry, who at the time was at Chelsea, or whether it was Eden Hazard, who later on, you know, the conversations are always there, and that's how they always start. There is no magic to it. It's identifying who you think can come and help you, and they're on your list, and we used to call them a target, and you would find a way to try and speak with the football club, and then in turn with the agent, and then in turn with the player. Now, there are so many checkpoints there. First one is if you don't get the player from the football club, it just keeps going on. But there are also players out there that were using us as a stalking horse. And that's the game, right? That's the complexity of the game. If you want to get a better contract in your renewal with the club that you're with, then you've got to try and raise a market. And they would do that too, the agents would do that. So the reality is, would we have liked a lot of them to come? Yes. The truth probably is some of them were maybe a little bit smoke and mirrors, but in some cases. But I think that if you move on a step, we were starting to get a few players who believed. So where Kaká didn't believe, then you move to a Yaya Toure and a David Silva, who for me, alongside James Milner, and obviously Sergio Aguero, were probably, those two were the catalyst for change, in my mind. Yes, Tevez, great addition, world class, great story, coming from Manchester, the poster, the whole 9 yards, but really David Silva and Yaya Toure, who were both very well accomplished footballers in the Spanish league, they made the big difference.
We'll come to Yaya and Silva in a moment, but I have to say my attention was gripped when you mentioned those two names, obviously John Terry and Eden Hazard. You said those checkpoints you have to go through. How many checkpoints do you think you went through with those two players? Did it get close?
You know, it's never close until you actually have a document that you're ready to sign, and there was never a document ready to sign.
Did you have confidence with Terry and Hazard at any point?
I would love to have seen John Terry at Manchester City. I think that John is, again, a true leader, and the dressing room needed leadership, and all football clubs need somebody, again, if you go back, Premier League experience, also had some Champions League experience, and was a great leader, England player. That was admittedly as good as all of those other names that we've talked about. Somebody like John Terry adds a whole different dimension to the growth of Manchester City.
Close,
but unfortunately, it wasn't to be.
Close or not?
You know what? We had conversations with him, and John decided to stay where he was, and quite rightly so.
So if you've had conversations with John Terry and his representatives, was that, and that has to be via the permission of the football club, so you've obviously spoken to Chelsea, and have they allowed you then to speak to John Terry?
Yeah, that again, going through the process. So you speak to, and again, Peter Kenyon was the man at the time, and we'd had conversations with him. We'd like to do it. We'd like to have a conversation. I think he probably was more confident that he wasn't going anywhere.
This would have caused huge ripples in the Premier League, wouldn't it, had that happened?
I'm sure it would have done.
More than any other player you would have signed. You've got to admit that.
Probably.
Yeah.
Yeah, probably.
Goodness me, that would have been something. That would have been a deadline day to remember as well. What was your working relationship and your personal relationship like with Sheikh Mansour and Khaldoon?
With Khaldoon, very close. We would speak daily, if not a couple of 3 times a day. Sheikh Mansour, we met 2 or 3 times. He came to visit the stadium once, and was very sportive, actually very knowledgeable about football. He enjoyed his football. We'd visit Abu Dhabi on many occasions, and we would spend a lot of time. But primarily Khaldoon was the guy, pulling the strings, and a very astute, smart business individual who really had a clear vision and direction, but most importantly allowed everybody to get on with what they were trying to do.
Garry, the summer of 2009, we see another step change in the transfers as well. Gareth Barry, Roque Santa Cruz, Carlos Tevez, Adebayor, Silvinho, Kolo Touré, Jolien Lescott. The Tevez one stands out for many, many reasons, of course. When did that start to materialise? I remember the Manchester derby when he scored against City towards the end of that season, the famous cupping of the ears celebration at the Manchester United manager and the board. Were the negotiations going on by then, or was it at the end of the season?
He was on loan at Manchester United, and so the opportunity arose whereby we had the chance to get in and have the conversation. Now, that doesn't always follow the normal protocol. There was, he wasn't under any contractual obligation with anybody at the time. And I found out about the fact that we were signing Carlos Tevez when I was watching the European Cup final against Barcelona. Ironically, Yaya Touré was playing centre half. And I was in Mallorca, and I got a call from Khaldoon who said some conversations have been taking place, and it looks like we're going to do. So I didn't really know much about it, but when we got out to Abu Dhabi, a lot of the work had already been done. So I took a few of our guys out there, and we closed everything for them. And he was a wonderful addition to the football club at the time. Made a noise, as Sir Alex Ferguson quite rightly pointed out publicly. He was another catalyst for change.
You talk about the various transfer windows from when you joined. When you look at the Tevez one, was that perhaps one of the biggest statements that City have made in the last 10 years, given he had played for United and he'd chosen then, I'm going to now play for City?
Yes, but again, the amplification of this seismic move came through the media, because this idea that he was moving from Manchester United to Manchester City, and we played on this whole story that is welcome to Manchester, because I
was going to ask you about that. Whose idea was that?
Well, there was an agency called Anomaly out of New York that I'd worked with, and we had a marketing guy called Dave Pullen, and it sort of came on my desk, and they said, "What do you think?" And I thought that's going to upset some people, and then they said, "Should we do it?" And I said, yeah, come on, let's go, let's make a difference.
Mark Hughes went in that December. In came Roberto Mancini. What was the thinking behind bringing Roberto in?
We'd grown up as a football club, having suffered a couple of generations of losses to our friends over the road. And so we had to do something that was going to change. A couple of players can make some changes, but you then needed to have the leader, the ultimate leader, surround himself with people who had a winning mentality. And Roberto had that. That didn't stop us speaking to the likes of Carlo Ancelotti, and we worked with Pere Guardiola, who was Pep's brother at Nike.
That's really interesting though, because you mentioned Pep. So he was being sounded out even then, and you had conversations with him even back then?
Yeah, I think that, and again, there are football clubs who, if you've been involved in that football club for a long period of time, Pep Guardiola had, you have a great respect for Barcelona, as with the other many great teams, whether it's the Milans or Real Madrid or any of them, Bayern Munich. Pep had a long time at Barcelona, and he'd understood the system, and he understood what success looked like, and he understood how to build that culture and that character. And yes, it would be professionally naive probably not to at least ask the question. Whether it was Jose Mourinho, and you speak to some of his guys and you ask the question, and they all had consideration, but they were all in different places at different times. The beauty of Roberto was he wasn't associated with any football club at that point in time. And we'd spoken to Inter Milan on a couple of occasions about various players, and their owner, and Marco Branca actually was the sporting director, and we'd had dinner in Milan, and I asked him a lot of questions about Roberto. And you get to know how somebody's going to operate by virtue of where they've been.
My ears did prick up, Gary, when you mentioned Jose Mourinho. So you had the conversation with him?
Agents.
And the response, no? Not now.
And maybe never. And that's okay. You can't take it personally.
Gary, when Pep said no back then, was there a feeling among the City hierarchy, even then, keep an eye on this guy, because long term, potentially he could be Manchester City manager. He's the kind of guy we want, because it seems that in the ensuing years, City have brought in people in their coaching staff that are very closely linked to Pep Guardiola. I'm just wondering, back in those days, was the card marked?
I think at the time, Barcelona were the biggest team. At the time, Barcelona had a culture, and they were changing the dynamics of world football. And the players that they had been in the youth team for years. It was reminiscent of the 90s with Manchester United. And those players had been together for many, many years. And so everybody was growing up in that system, and they attracted the attention of the world. And so Pep Guardiola was one of those guys. Is there an opportunity to bring in the CEO from Barcelona and the football director from Barcelona? If they've created and been part of creating the world's best environment, then why wouldn't your ambition lead you to that? Which then leads you down the pathway of Pep Guardiola. And of course, it was well documented at the time that Pep wasn't ready, so therefore Manuel Pellegrini stepped in. But if the ambition to be the biggest and the best in the world, then you're probably going to have to speak to the biggest and the best in the world.
January 2010 was a relatively quiet window. Patrick Vieira, Adam Johnson came into the football club. City ended the season in 5th. Was that looked at as a real blow and a real setback to City's ambition at the time?
Yeah, there was a catalyst in that momentum. If you think about it, the last 5 games we had a terrible record, but 5 games to go, we lost Shay Given to a dislocated shoulder, if you remember. But the outcome of that season, and I think it was Peter Crouch who put the nail in our coffin. And I remember turning to Khaldoon, and Khaldoon, again, this is the great leadership skill that he has, turned to me and he said, "Don't worry, it's okay. It wasn't to be." Now that's all he needed to say. He didn't get angry. He just, it's okay. We know where we're going. We know what we've got to do. And ironically, again, the following year, it was all about Peter Crouch, and unfortunately he scored a home goal, and we went and we got into the Champions League. So the ambition was to get to the Champions League. We fell over a little bit at the end there by virtue of the complexities of football, but there was a lot of drama and some great stories.
That summer, Jerome Boateng, Kolarov, Mario Balotelli, James Milner, and then perhaps two of the best midfielders in the world at the time, Yaya Toure and David Silva. Just give us an insight into the significance of the arrivals of those two. I know you touched on it before, but just give us a better idea now.
Yeah, again, the theme's starting to change, right? So now you've got Mario Balotelli, ex-Inter Milan. Roberto Mancini gave him his debut at Inter Milan. Kolarov had come from Roma. There's now a new trend starting to develop, and I think, like everybody in business, you like to know the comfort of what you're getting, people you've worked with before. But I think with Yaya and David Silva, Yaya was a colossal character with immense amounts of talent, who had played inside that Barcelona network in various positions. And David Silva was that player that you just knew. He was actually part of a package with David Villa when we met with Valencia. And
so you could have got Villa as well?
Well, if you want to spend that sort of money. The difficulty was trying to unpackage them, because we didn't want that to happen. We wanted David Silva, and Roberto wanted David Silva. Roberto was the one that was driving that, and also Yaya. And as we went through it, there was a little bit of, I always refer to it as the Bob Geldof moment. There was a little bit of telling David Silva that Yaya Toure is coming, and telling Yaya Toure that David Silva is coming, neither of which were signed and sealed and delivered. And I always felt that they knew each other in the Spanish league, and so there was sort of that other tipping point which said, well, if he's going, maybe there is something happening there. So there was a little bit of that, but I think they were the catalysts for change, and I remember every moment of the discussions and the negotiations. To get them both that year, I think, was probably the single biggest dynamic change, alongside Sergio Aguero the following year, and there'd be Gareth Barry and James Milner, and all of those were great additions. But those two, for me, were the ones that made a big difference.
That's huge. I mean, Dzeko came in January, and then from that, City finish in the Champions League places, and they get that trophy. How massive a moment was that FA Cup win?
It was huge. We'd brought in Brian Kidd, if you remember, and he said, Gary, when you win the first one, that's the catalyst that helps you win the rest. And he said, once you enjoy that success, that's what you want. And we hadn't had that as a club. And that didn't mean just the players. That meant the management, the employees, the fans, and it changed the whole dynamics of what we were about that day. Obviously the semi-final, Yaya scoring the winner against Manchester United, but then Yaya scoring again. You know, he was that whole moment was really to be etched in the history of the football club, whose dynamic, moments in history were a bit limited compared to our partners over the road. And I think that FA Cup is more symbolic than anything else that we've done in the last 10 years, only because of what it created and the way it changed the culture and the way it changed the mentality. The FA Cup's it's dear to us, but globally it's not as dear as winning the Champions League, of course. But to our football club, to the 300 employees and the thousands of fans, it was another indication and a manifestation of the hope that was to become reality.
That summer, Gary, Clichy arrived, Stefan Savic, Samir Nasri, Owen Hargreaves, Pantilimon and Sergio Aguero. Who else was in for him, and how did you get him?
And I have to say, the decision for signing Sergio Aguero, while it was a great opportunity and Roberto Mancini would never say no, I would say that Khaldoon Al-Mubarak would be the one ultimately responsible for bringing in Sergio Aguero. Khaldoon is very knowledgeable about football. He's a student of the game, and he's made some very good decisions for Manchester City based on his football background alongside and parlayed with his business background. That was two superpowers coming together to buy a superpower to put him into the football team, and he equally created drama that will probably never be seen again. And that moment, that goal, ironically against QPR, ironically Mark at the helm, it was a script. You couldn't write that. You couldn't have made that up. And you know, when Martin's Aguero moment, it resonated around the world. But behind the scenes, it had taken place in a restaurant in Los Angeles with the three of us over dinner. And that's the bit that people don't get to see.
Finally, Garry, what have you made of City's progress since you've left the football club? And are we seeing the start of a dynasty? Well,
dynasties are, you know, we always look back and say it was a dynasty. I don't think you actually want to say we're creating a dynasty, so I'd be very careful there. I was only ever declaring our ambition, saying that we were going to be one of the world's biggest football clubs, and that's all proven to be right, again with tongue in cheek. The institution of Manchester City has got a mixture of people who have been at the club for 25, 30 years, and it's got a mixture of people who have come from all sorts of industry to work for one of the biggest and best football clubs in the world. And I think that's a testament to building the building blocks, or building the basis of those building blocks to create the future. There will be trials and there will be tribulations, because that is football and it's the world that we all live in. But I don't think what they've done in the last 10 years will ever be done again. And my part was to be a proud guardian of my moment, and I'm proud of it. But I'm more proud of the people that were involved in it, because we've all got a story and we can all look at each other and go, I was there. And not many people can do that.
Thanks for sharing your story, Garry Cook. Thank you very much.
Yeah, I appreciate that. Thank you.